Okay, and I think we're ready to begin. Welcome everybody to this delightful occasion in which we have a Thesis Theater where Gina is going to present her work to you. So I'd just like to introduce Gina first of all. Gina has written the most wonderful thesis on Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, which is one of my favorite stories of all time. And this one is a fascinating kind of gothic take on it. The title to her thesis is Let Me In, Vampirism in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Okay, welcome, Gina.
Hello.
Hi, okay, so let's kick this Thesis Theatre off by giving us a brief overview of your thesis. Would you like to do that for us?
Sure. So what I did was I did a close reading of Wuthering Heights in the lens of looking for any indications of vampirism in there. And then from there, I asked the question, okay, if there are vampires, there is vampirism, why? And so I sort of went from there and figured out a whole feminist lens and just sort of marginalized characters lens and found some really interesting stuff.
A feminist lens. I wonder why I enjoyed this so much. Okay, thank you for that. All right, everybody. Gina's going to give us a short presentation in a moment on her thesis. So I'm going to invite you, if you have any questions at all to ask Gina, then can you pop them into the Q&A box, preferably not the chat. Feel free to chat away in the chat, but the questions might get lost there. So if you wouldn't mind, if you do have questions, and I would encourage you to have them, please put them into the Q&A for us. Okay, Gina, so I believe you have a slideshow to share with us?
Yes.
Okay. That
right.
Looks great. All right, I'm going to turn my camera off so that people can focus just on you. All right?
Okay.
You're ready.
All right. So let me close my little Zoom box here. All right. So my thesis title is Let Me In, Vampirism in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Okay. So before I dive into the thesis, I just wanted to take a minute to sort of explain where this all came from. So I knew that I wanted to do something for my thesis that related back to Dr. Femi's folkloric transformations class. That was my favorite class that I took at Signum, and it really led me down a path of discovery of things that I was really interested in, and led me to the area of monster theory. And so I wanted to do something with that. And my best friend had just randomly said, did you know that there's a theory that there's vampires in Wuthering Heights? And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And so I did a little Googling. I found a blog post on Lit Reactor. I will totally butcher her name. So, but Annie N. And so she said that Catherine turns into a vampire. She's not a ghost. And then later at the end of the story, she turns Heathcliff into a vampire. So I was like, I hadn't read Wuthering Heights since high school, so I figured I would give it a shot. And so I did a rereading of it, strictly looking for any indications of vampirism, and was pleasantly surprised. So I was on board with vampires in Wuthering Heights, but was asking the question of why? Why would Emily Brontë write that? So just a quick little refresher for anybody who hasn't read Wuthering Heights since high school, or I know that some people watching have never read Wuthering Heights. These are the characters. Really, we're focusing on Catherine or Cathy and Heathcliff. And so those are the two characters. They grew up together with her brother Hindley. Cathy and Heathcliff love each other, but can never be together. And that's sort of all the heartbreak of the novel. But yeah, so we will focus on those two characters. Okay, so I did not focus on the entirety of the novel. I really focused on 3 sections: the beginning of the novel, a little bit after that, still in like part 1, and then the very, very end. So there's actually a huge chunk of the novel that I didn't really have to do anything with. It was just really these 3 parts that had the vampirism that I was looking for. So what I did for this presentation is really try to scale back, and I have a lot of research done, and I have a lot of annotations and a lot of evidence and passages, but I tried to pick out just a few from each part, just so you could kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. So really the first part is at the very, very beginning of the novel, and it's sort of our introduction to the vampire. And so at the beginning of the story, we have this sort of outside narrator, Mr. Lockwood. He is renting property. He ends up staying at Wuthering Heights for the night. And he gets put in Cathy's old room. He has no idea about any of the history or anything like that. He's having terrible nightmares. And then he is hearing like tapping on the window. For some reason, he punches through the glass, and we just kind of ignore that. But he's trying to get a tree branch outside, and instead a hand grasps him on the wrist. And so it says, "The intense horror of nightmare came over me. I tried to draw back my arm, but the hand clung to it, and a most melancholy voice sobbed, 'Let me in, let me in.'" And so that's really one of the most important passages that I found. And that's because something that I go into in the paper are different characteristics of vampirism. And one of them that's been passed down is that vampires have to be invited into the home. They can't just stroll in and bite you. So she is asking to be let in. But as you see in the second passage, he says, "As it spoke, I discerned obscurely a child's face looking through the window." So I do put this argument in there as well, that this is also, this could be a characteristic. It's in some folklore and not in others, but that vampires want to look enticing to their prey. So she's trying to look like this poor, helpless, defenseless young girl trying to be let in. But he's really freaked out, and he just is trying to get away from her. It says, "Terror made me cruel, and finding it useless to attempt shaking the creature off, I pulled its wrist onto the broken pane and rubbed it to and fro till the blood ran down and soaked the bedclothes. Still it wailed, 'Let me in,' and maintained its tenacious grip, almost maddening me with fear." So this should be the moment where you're like, if this is Cathy's ghost, then why is she bleeding? She's putting blood everywhere when he cuts her wrists on the broken window pane. And she doesn't care, which, vampires might feel pain, depending on the folklore, but it doesn't really matter because they're already dead. So it seems like it doesn't bother her that she's bleeding everywhere and that she has been harmed. She's still grabbing onto him and demanding to be let in. And then Lockwood's screaming wakes everybody up, and Heathcliff just automatically thinks it's Cathy, knows that it's Cathy. And he says, come in, he sobbed. "Cathy, do come. Oh, do once more. Oh, my heart's darling, hear me this time, Catherine at last." And so this is the other important piece of part 1, where Heathcliff has done the thing. He has invited Cathy in, and that's going to set off a chain of events that don't come until the end of the novel, because after this moment, in the morning, Lockwood starts to get the story of Cathy and Heathcliff and Wuthering Heights and everybody from Nellie the maid. And so we sort of like have a flashback from there. Okay. So then the next part I am working with is Cathy's transformation. So like I said before, there's a lot that goes into this. There's a lot of passages and a lot of evidence. I just picked out a couple things. So there's this one that comes up many times. This is Nellie the maid talking. As she never offered to descend to breakfast next morning, I went to ask whether she would have some carried up. The same question was repeated at dinner and tea, and again on the morrow after, and received the same answer. So we have gone through Cathy and Heathcliff's childhood. There's a part where Cathy tells Nellie that she is never going to be able to marry Heathcliff, and Heathcliff runs away. And she was really saying that because she wanted to get married to their neighbor, so that then afterwards she would sort of be able to support Heathcliff, because she would have, you know, some kind of money from somewhere. And so Heathcliff has come back, and Cathy thinks that she can just have both men, and her husband's like, I don't think so. So she sort of has this transformation afterwards. And so at this point, Cathy is very pregnant, and she's not eating anything. She's refusing to eat anything. And Nellie makes reference to this over and over and over. There's also lots of passages about how she is sort of acting a little bit crazy, like this one, tossing about. She increased her feverish bewilderment to madness and tore the pillow with her teeth. Then raising herself up, all burning, desired that I would open the window. We were in the middle of winter. The wind blew strong from the northeast, and I objected. Both the expressions flitting over her face and the changes of her moods began to alarm me terribly, and brought to my recollection her former illness. So this was actually the second time that this strange unnamed illness had come over Cathy. I do make a case that perhaps she had gotten bitten earlier, and it's sort of up to interpretation, and that maybe now the transformation, she has been bitten again, but actually to be transformed this time. But she has these sort of like fits of madness, and there's a lot of like focus on her teeth, which of course vampires' teeth, yes. And Nellie just doesn't know what to do with it, because this is so unlike Cathy that, and unlike a sick person, that she's not really sure what's going on. She also talks about Cathy's delirious strength was much surpassed mine. And so vampires are known to have this sort of super strength. And this is, you know, somebody who hasn't eaten in a few days, is very pregnant. And yet she's able to overpower quite easily the maid who's been doing, you know, hard work all her life. Her husband even notices and says months of sickness could not cause such a change. We also have some ties to religion that I talk about, where Cathy on more than one occasion is sort of denouncing her faith and religion. So for example, she'll say, I'll not lie there by myself. They may bury me 12 feet deep and throw the church down over me, but I won't rest till you are with me. I never will. Talking about Heathcliff. And so she's sort of almost putting like a curse on them, that she's never going to rest unless Heathcliff is with her. And then finally, the last little bit is Nellie telling Heathcliff, when he demands to see her for the last time, that she is, you know, very different. Her appearance has changed greatly, her character much more so, that Nellie can't understand Cathy's transformation. And of course, how could she? And she's just trying to prepare Heathcliff for that. Another thing that I go into with this whole transformation part for Cathy is, I just sort of try to give the options that here's sort of what could have happened if there was, a vampire in the area and she got bit, or there's also some scholarship of maybe she is sort of making herself into a vampire just through her own madness. But I sort of lay out the specs for both. And then lastly, we skip all the way to the end. So now Mr. Lockwood has gotten the whole history of Cathy and Heathcliff and Wuthering Heights and everybody. And so now we're like just about caught up. And Heathcliff, he gives this very strange admission that he says, "I'll tell you what I did yesterday. I got the sexton who was digging Linton's grave to remove the earth off her coffin lid, and I opened it. I thought once I would have stayed there. When I saw her face again, it is hers yet." So this is an important piece because Heathcliff pays the sexton to disturb Cathy's grave, and there's not, a skeleton there. She's been dead for a very long time, like maybe 20 years, that she looks exactly the same as if she has been preserved. And so, why that would be strange, but if she were a vampire, then sure, just kind of hanging out in there. And this could be, I sort of argue why after this is where she sort of appears to Lockwood to get into Wuthering Heights. So it could be that Heathcliff has sort of like awakened her for her to come out. So then now we are all caught up. We're now in the present. It's after the whole thing with Mr. Lockwood. And Heathcliff begins to act really strangely. He's going out at night and just like wandering the moors by himself when he thinks everybody has gone to bed, and Nellie listens out for him and he never comes back. He's just out there doing who knows what, which if Cathy's whole thing is that she wants to make Heathcliff a vampire so they can be together, it makes sense. They're out there wandering around together. And then we have a lot of description about his transformation. So this is an example that he has this unnatural appearance of joy because he would be really happy. All he's ever wanted is Cathy. And now that she has come back, and maybe he can't understand why, it doesn't matter to him because he's soon going to be with Cathy forever. He has a bloodless sort of pallor. His teeth, again, there's lots of description about his teeth, and that he's shivering, not because he's cold, but because he's like so excited for what's to come. Again, with him, he also stops eating completely. There's lots of moments where he like goes to try to eat something and he can't, because vampires are sustained on blood. So if this is part of the transformation, it's like he knows he's hungry, but he has human food in front of him, but he doesn't want to eat that and he can't understand why. He even says at some point, I know I'm hungry, but I can't seem to eat this. He stopped breathing during half a minute together. So it's sort of like his body is shutting down for the transformation until finally Nellie finds him and he has died. He's died in Cathy's old bedroom. And he has this hand that looks like it's been wounded from that broken window they haven't fixed. And yet there's no blood at all. So, if he's been drained because he's been turned into a vampire, could work. And then finally, the very, very, very end, right after that, we have a couple different people have told Nellie that they've seen Heathcliff and Cathy. Well, they don't seem to know it's Cathy. Maybe they just don't remember Cathy because it's been a long time, but they see Heathcliff and they see a woman and they're just walking the moors together. So from there, sort of intertwined with all of this, I have some scholarship in there of answering the why, like why would Emily Brontë have vampires? What is the, the motive? So I go into different characteristics and lore about vampires, and, trying to focus on what probably would have been known at the time. I know that there's a lot of more modern characteristics that we have today that come out in TV and movies and books and so on, but that might not have been around back then. I also sort of focus on, this is a commentary that Brontë has on marginalized society. So we don't know a lot about her, but we do have some letters and things that she's written, and in these things she has written about how she felt her society was unnatural, and how that perhaps things aren't the way they should be. And so having this strong female character who wants to be free from her society, and the only way she can do that is to turn into a monster, is something that can certainly be argued. And then you have Heathcliff, who in the original version is a Roma, that he's another marginalized character. He is viewed as less than because of who he is and can never be with Cathy. So he then turns into a monster. I mean, he turns into a monster during the whole novel, but then he turns into this other type of monster so that he and Cathy can be together. And then I also talk about how at this time, it was a common trope for novels to have a character that has some kind of illness or something, and then they come out of it changed for the better. And so they certainly are changing. I think at the time, Bronte's society would not have thought they changed for the better, but I think that we could argue that they do, because they end up being together and free from their society, so they can just sort of be together and be free. Okay, so that is a very short rundown of everything.
Thanks, Gina. Absolutely wonderful. If you'd like to stop sharing screen.
Oh, there it is. It's on the bottom.
Clearly, that's it. Thank you very much. Fascinating stuff. I hope everybody enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed reading through this when Gina was actually doing the writing. Okay, so I'm going to ask Gina some questions in a moment, but let me encourage you to put your own questions into the question box if you've got anything you would like to ask her about her work. But while people are thinking about what you've just presented, Gina, can you explain to us how and why you chose that particular topic?
Yeah, so I just knew from my love of Dr. Feeney's class that I really wanted to do something with that. And it's led me down the path of learning more and more about monster studies, and how I just didn't even know that was, a field that you could study. And that's something that I'm really, really interested in, just not because monsters are cool, but, where do they come from and why? And seeing all of these, cultural significances has just been really interesting. And so from there, my best friend had just randomly was like, I heard this. And then I just kind of got sucked in after I reread Wuthering Heights, and I didn't want to do anything else.
The vampire is such an interesting figure in culture, and so culturally embedded. The history of the vampire in culture is absolutely fascinating. So I was delighted when you were talking about this and applying it to Wuthering Heights, which I hadn't done, but then I hadn't read Wuthering Heights since high school, pretty much like so many other people, but it gave me a fascinating new focus on that story. So Tamara has a question which actually kind of connects with a question I was going to ask you. She asks, what kind of vampire literature predates Brontë? And I was going to ask you, if Brontë wrote Wuthering Heights in 1847 and Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in 1897, would Brontë have been familiar with vampire stories at the time of her writing? So those two questions really do mesh well together.
Perfect. Yes. Short answer, yes. So a lot of what we take today is because of Dracula, but for Brontë, there were some penny dreadfuls out there, like Barney the Vampire was very popular. But then we also had Carmilla was out there and was also very, very popular. So there actually was, there were a few vampire things out there in literature that she most likely would have been aware of, as well as just, you know, the folk history that everybody just sort of got passed down with.
Absolutely. I mean, famously, one of the first in English was John Polidori's The Vampire, which predates the other ones that you mentioned as well. But they come in at the beginning of the first Gothic revival. And we know, of course, that Brontë was absolutely fascinated with the Gothic. And by the time she was writing, the idea of the vampire was thoroughly embedded in the idea of the Gothic. But as you say, so many stories actually from a long time before it enters popular literature that are passed down through various cultures, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the next question. How do you think Cathy would have been turned into a vampire?
So I had two things that I sort of looked at. There was one where my second reader, Dr. Dickinson, had sort of pushed me on that maybe metaphorically Cathy undergoes this transformation where she, you know, she's maybe not turning into a literal vampire, but is still, you know, vampiric. So I offer that side of things. But then if you're somebody that's like, no, I want real vampires. I thought about when the night that Heathcliff runs away, Cathy runs outside, and there's a whole section in my paper where she's outside by herself. It's nighttime. She's out there all night. That she could have gotten bitten then, because then she gets very, very ill. Nobody knows what's wrong with her. She's sick for a long time. So it could be that she had been drained, but then she's okay. But then perhaps another vampire comes when Heathcliff comes back months later, and you know, the transformation happens then. That's kind of my theory.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. All right, so here's the thing about when this was being written, right? England was still very much a Christian country, and the whole concept of vampirism really works against that. And you were talking about how Cathy seemed to be rejecting her religion, rejecting belief as she was changing and becoming something, whether she's becoming a vampire or not, of course, all down to different people's interpretation, but she's certainly changing. So do you read Cathy and Heathcliff's vampirism as some form of punishment then, given the time and place in which it's set?
So I like to think two things. I like to think that the readers of the day, if they caught on to this, that they would have felt satisfied that, you know, Cathy, who makes these statements against her religion, which would have been, you know, crazy to make, especially by a woman, and that she's very wild, and Heathcliff, you know, he's Roma, so people don't really care so much about him. I feel like people would have been like, yes, okay, they turn into monsters, they deserve to turn into monsters. But I think for us, and we can sort of see the way Emily was thinking aligns with how we think today, that they're not being punished, that this was the only way that they could be together in their society. And so it's not really that they're transforming into monsters, they're just transforming into something else so that they can be free forever and live how they always wanted to live.
Mm-hmm. So a great gothic romance from a 21st century lens then.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that that was the story that Emily Brontë was trying to tell, not the punishment version, but the great gothic romance version?
I think so. I like to think so.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Because what also interests me is that if Heathcliff becomes a vampire, he becomes other, right? But he's already other because he's Roma and he is an outcast in society. He cannot be with Cathy because social norms mean that it is forbidden. So he's already other, right? So is it worse or no different for him to become a vampire?
Yeah, I feel like it's almost worse. That I think just, you know, from like a racism point of view, that people are like, yeah, you know, he's even worse now and he deserves that. Whereas for us in the, you know, in this century, we're like, oh, okay, he's, you know, he's just transforming so that he can be his real self without any restrictions.
Mm-hmm. So the perception of the vampire as a figure has really changed since Bronte's time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the vampire is now more of a romantic figure than perhaps it was back in Bronte's time.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Are there other examples from modern vampire fiction that you thought about while you were investigating the vampiric nature of Wuthering Heights?
Well, I mean, I try not to think of Twilight, but
Good call.
we had read the first book in the True Blood series in Dr. Femy's class, and that, like, you know, sent me spiraling into reading the entire series. But I also was a huge fan of I Am Legend, and you know, the vampires in there that, you know, when you realize they're not the monster, we're the monsters. So I think that was like a huge turning point.
Yes, the way in which it kind of turns around from the idea that the vampire is always the monster to somehow not necessarily is a fascinating study of society itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Right, so turning from specifics about your thesis, let's think about the process that you went through, because let's face it, it's a big process and it demands a lot of you, doesn't it?
Yes.
You did a lot of research for this, as all the students do that are doing their master's thesis. Did you come across anything that surprised you that you weren't expecting?
Yeah. So I read a lot of things that I didn't end up using, but just were like so fascinating. But I think coming across things like the very little that's out there about Brontë herself, I think was really interesting. And I think that that really helped me cement what I was thinking was really going somewhere, that, you know, she herself seemed like she didn't fit in that society and in that time period. And it just made me start looking at things in a different way.
So what sort of details did you come across that told you that she didn't really fit in her own time?
In one of the books that I was reading, they were talking about different letters and different essays that she had written, and she just sounded very outspoken, which, you know, was not a thing back then, but she wasn't afraid to sort of speak her mind. And that also reminded me of Cathy, who is, you know, supposed to be very wild in Wuthering Heights. But just her views on society were so modern that, you know, she just felt like this isn't how it's supposed to be. And she didn't want to live in this type of society.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, isn't it, that both she and her sisters wrote Gothic novels. Given what you just said, is there a connection, do you think, and I'm just kind of thinking out of my own head at the moment, is there a connection, do you think, between that kind of attitude that Emily Brontë had and the way in which she just perhaps did not fit right in the society in which she was situated? Do you think there's a connection between that and the fact that actually within the Gothic genre, there's a plethora of female writers in this time? So many women writers turning to the Gothic.
Yeah, I think that women were starting to realize that they could be more and that they should be seen as more, but the constraints of society, you know, wouldn't really lend them to opportunities. And so one opportunity could be that I could write something, and, you know, Emily Brontë and her sisters, they had to pretend they were men, of course, but it didn't matter, you know, their words were still out there.
Right. Yeah, it's always struck me that all of those elements of the Gothic, like the outsider, the other, the supernatural, all those things seem to really speak to certain kind of women in that, a woman in that time. And I do think that's really interesting. Okay, so apart from all this reading you had to do and you come across stuff that you found really interesting, the writing process, right? Because you do all of this reading and then you've got to turn it into your own piece of work. So one of the problems that students often come across is, well, they start off thinking, oh, 10 to 15,000 words, that's plenty. And then they start writing and realize that, oh, that is not actually plenty. I need far more space. And you've got to start taking out some of your core ideas because there just isn't room for it. I don't think I've had any thesis student yet who hasn't had to cut at least one core idea that they've been hoping to put into their work. So can you tell us, was there anything that you wanted to include in your thesis that you had to leave out, or certain ideas or aspects that you wanted to pursue but couldn't?
I think I would have wanted to include more excerpts from Bronte's letters and essays that we have, just to sort of highlight it a little bit more. And I think I would have liked to have gone a little bit more in depth with maybe like the Roma culture, just to explain that a little bit more, and why that would, you know, automatically make Heathcliff this outsider. I would, if I had more space, I would definitely take more time with those things.
So put some more cultural context in.
Mm-hmm.
Did you actually do any reading about perceptions of Roma in the 19th century?
A little bit here and there, but I didn't focus solely on that, but I would like to, if I have the opportunity to make it longer. I know it's not good, so.
Well, I mean, it still is not good.
It's still not good. Yeah.
Okay. So there are students out there who are either about to begin their thesis process or are looking at it as coming up within the next year or so. Would you have any advice for these people? Something that you've picked up, learned through your own experience of going through the thesis process?
I would say start by asking yourself what you're interested in and go from there. I wouldn't pick your most favorite thing in the universe, because you might end up becoming really sick of it at the end. But I would pick something that interests you, and then as you start to do research, just be really open with the things that you're finding, because you might think that you have an idea and you go left and you end up writing something else. I thought I was going to write about I Am Legend, and I had read all this research into I Am Legend, and then it sort of derailed into something else entirely. But even a lot of the things that I read for this thesis that I didn't end up using, I think was still really valuable just for my, my studies as a whole. And that can lead me down to writing other papers in the future.
Let's hope so. What would you say was the hardest thing that you encountered during the process? What was the toughest element for you? Which could be something to do with the thesis itself. It could be something to do with, the process. What was the toughest thing?
I think maybe the toughest thing was just trying to sit down and outline my thoughts of, okay, this is my question, this is the information I have, but how am I going to put it all together? Because I had actually never written something that long before. So I had to figure out, how am I going to put all of these things together? And I know as a teacher, I make my students do outlines all the time, and I don't like doing them personally, but like, you have to, you have to. And I, shared that with them when they were writing their own papers, like you have to have some kind of a guide to help you, because you can't just sit down and write a thesis.
Absolutely not. So can I ask you then how you approached creating that structure? What was your process for doing that?
I sort of put down the things that I knew I had down pat first. So like my close readings, like I put those all in. And then from there, I sort of figured where I could start intertwining the research, and like, okay, so this section I could really get into some of like the feminist lens. Over here, I can start to get into just like the cultural background of the time period, things like that. So that once I could see something in front of me, it became a little bit clearer of where I could weave my research.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, there's some nice comments for you in the chat box. I've been keeping a little bit of an eye on that. Tamara says that all made so much sense, and thank you. Courtney said, brilliant, so many details she didn't catch or completely overlooked. And Takako said, yes, female monsters are cool. And Takako, you're not wrong. Female monsters are cool. They're really interesting. And when you were talking about whether it was a punishment or not for Cathy and Heathcliff to be turned into vampires, and decided that from at least a 21st century perspective, it was not. Tamara said maybe now they can be equals because they're both outside human categories now. So yeah. Good points all, thank you. So if there are no other questions, what I want to do now is congratulate Gina, because what you, the audience, see is the end product of months of hard work and dedication, and just putting one foot in front of the other, even when it's difficult. And I don't think any thesis student gets to this point without acknowledging that there are points of difficulty when it comes to writing a piece of this size and depth. So I'd like to present to you all Gina Petrone, who has now passed her master's degree with Signum, and a large and hearty round of applause to you. Absolutely fantastic. Well done. It's a crowning achievement, and you should be extremely proud of yourself.
Thank you. I could not have done it without you.
You probably could, but no, you're welcome. It was a lot of fun working with you, and I've always been very interested in the Gothic and in the vampire as a figure, so this was a lot of fun for me to work with as well. So, and I'd also like to thank Dr. Brenton Dickinson, who acted as Gina's second reader and did such a marvelous job to help you in the latter stages of your thesis process. So thank you a lot, Brenton. All right, everybody, thank you so much for attending this Thesis Theatre. It's lovely to have people come along to support Gina and to show her that you appreciate the hard work that she has put into this this wonderful piece of writing, which will be deposited in the Signum library. So any Signum student will be able to check out that thesis and have a look for yourself at all the wonderful work that Gina has done. So on that note, thank you very much, Gina. I'll be seeing you at graduation.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. And we are done. Congratulations, Gina. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
See you next time.